George P. Bush. So let's say hello to Mr. Bush and talk about a couple other things as well. Welcome, sir. How are you doing?
Good morning, Mark. I like that lead-in music, by the way.
It's a little ZZ Top, little band from Texas.
Kind of charges you up.
Absolutely. That is my goal every day. Before we do anything Texas Attorney General related, let me go to something else on your resume, if I may. Having served better part of a year in Afghanistan, I wonder if you have a thought about how that's worked out in the last few weeks.
Well, I think as a military veteran, we're all disappointed with the lack of attention, the lack of care and professionalism dedicated to withdrawing. I think among your listeners, whether you agreed or disagreed with the action, I think everybody would agree that getting out is just as hard as getting in. And we did it the wrong way. President Trump was recently interviewed, and he put it succinctly by saying you get your civilians, you get your assets out, you get your military equipment, you get the third parties that helped us in the conflict before our soldiers evacuate. And we did the exact opposite thing, and we're seeing the consequence of that. So I don't know about you, Mark. I don't trust the Taliban to hold their word in this. And so right now, there's going to be plenty of time to Monday morning quarterback on it. There's going to be a lot of blame to go around. The president shares it, and he himself has said, the buck stops with me. But right now, we got to get as many American citizens out as possible. There's some great nonprofits that are evacuating in addition to government efforts. And let's hope that we can keep the peace until the August 31st deadline.
You come from a family that contains a couple of recent presidents and obviously have some familiarity in the world of the most recent president, Donald Trump. Do you think a lot of people, and I don't know if you have a special thought on this, if so, fine. If not, don't worry. The notion that, well, Trump would have done it differently. Trump wanted to get out, too. He actually was ahead of the conservative curve on the need to pull out of Afghanistan. I had a famous conversation with him in 2012. I said, you ain't going to win the Republican nomination saying that. And by the way, at the time I was right. Now, a majority of people say it was time to get out of Afghanistan, but not like this. Do you believe President Trump would have left 1,000 or 2,000 residual troops at Bagram that would have prevented this nightmare?
Well, I think he would have done it in a strategic way with his national security team to make sure, again, that we got our critical assets, our military equipment. I know that President Trump would not have left billions of dollars of hardware and software that our known enemies can now utilize in the battlefield against us and our allies. He wouldn't have let 10 to estimated 15,000 American citizens to be stranded in Afghanistan. I mean, what president does that, or at least take the intelligence, even conservatively, and say, look, we've got to have an evacuation plan for these citizens. Yes, President Trump signed on to the agreement to eventually withdraw, and I think a majority of Americans would agree with that. But I think where an overwhelming majority, almost 4 out of 5, are saying, look, the way this has been done under Biden is the wrong way to do it. So, again, there's going to be a lot of hindsight, a lot of revisionism as it relates to how the events are playing out. But right now, we've just got to focus on citizens. And, of course, think about what the next steps mean for our allies. I mean, does our word stay as strong as the bond that it once did in the past, whether that's in flashpoints like the Gulf of Aden, the Ukraine, the Taiwan Strait, where there are some strategic interests at play here that are suddenly called into question.
George P. Bush on the phone with us, running for Attorney General, GeorgePBush.com, the website. Let's talk about some Attorney General Texas type things. It has been weeks now of back and forth tugs of war in law, school districts, governor saying you can do one thing that I can stop you from having a mask mandate. Bunch of school districts running rogue and saying, guess what? We're going to have one anyway. It's all in the courts now. What's your evaluation of this current moment of struggle in COVID mask policy?
Well, in my opinion, the Texas Disaster Act is clear that the governor has the executive authority to basically pull down school mandates that relate to masks, in addition to the vaccination policies that we've seen or proposed at the local level. And this is a struggle, honestly, that's been going on for a very long time, and I wish the legislature could have intervened this past session to be more clear as to the governor's authority. I happen to be of the opinion that the governor in the state of Texas should have outsized executive authority. And the reason is because we have a citizen legislature that only meets once every other year for 5 months. And so you can't have a head executive kind of wait for a permission slip from the legislature during the interim or during times of crisis. And so I full-heartedly agree with the governor's position on this, that the Texas Disaster Act gives him this authority to act. And, we'll see how the court system plays out on the individual issues that are percolating. But cities have a very broad authority, and that's where the conflict is in terms of the question of law. I just happen to side with the state on this one.
And so with the mask tug of war, do you believe that ultimately, once all the court dust has settled, that Governor Abbott's authority to say to school districts, you cannot do a mask mandate, that authority will stand?
Yes, I'm confident in that. I think the Supreme Court, Texas State Supreme Court, will agree with the governor on that issue. And if it does get appealed in the federal courts, which they may decide to receive at some point and look at it from state to state, that'll be a different road. But I think as it relates to a temporary injunctive relief for the state, I feel confident that we will win there. But one thing I should also add, Mark, is that, and this is, again, why I'm a big supporter of school choice, is that in states like Florida, where they have opportunity scholarships, Governor DeSantis has said, look, this should be a choice for the parent. We've lost that in this discussion, as opposed to politicians and local officials kind of pointing the finger at each other and suing each other. We need to get back to an education process that empowers the parent to make this choice and to allow them to use opportunity scholarships to transfer their kids to a school that doesn't have such restrictions and mandates. And who would have thought that you could have school choice, but, in states like Florida, they got it. We don't. We need it.
George P. Bush with us, running for Attorney General, georgepbush.com, the website. Let's go from masks to the bear trap of vaccines. That's always exciting. Lots of, even in hospitals, some hospital folks, Houston Methodist, famously had a sliver, but a big hospital system. So it was a sliver featuring, I think, 100 and some people who said, we don't want the vaccine. They got fired. Give me the George P. Bush paragraph on a private entity's latitude in having a vaccine mandate for employees.
Well, legally, unfortunately, a lot of private entities have pretty substantial protection to require or at least provide financial incentives to their employees. But I think where we draw the line in the sand is as it relates to public entities. And that's where President Biden's executive order requiring healthcare workers to get vaccinated is something that I'm actually taking a look at legally on behalf of the General Land Office. This is federal overreach as it relates to Medicare, Medicaid programs. And I think that healthcare workers should have that choice. But regretfully, Mark, on the private sector side of things, it's going to be challenging, particularly being in a right-to-work state. I think some would agree that maybe financial incentives would be the way to go. But ultimately, and that's probably more defensible legally, but individuals should make that choice, not the government.
Okay, true. So with what you just mentioned, you don't want the federal government telling any health entity in Texas what to have in terms of vax policy. But and let's take it from hospitals to any other private employer that wants to have a vaccine mandate, can they?
My understanding, and I'll have to get back to you on relevant case law, but it's pretty solid in terms of their ability to require that. But where public leadership can get involved, or perhaps a future AG like myself, is examine that and get to the bottom of that and work with potential plaintiffs to represent constituents of Texas. I mean, people forget consumer protection is a big part of the role, and protecting consumers and making sure that the actual vaccine itself is acceptable and palatable for constituents is a big concern. So there's areas there in which we can investigate and work. But I'm just managing expectations that the case law is pretty solid on their side. In our last couple of minutes, George P. Bush, anytime there's a primary, I always like to ask, hey, what do you think about the other guy? Is there anything good Lord knows Paxton's been all over the place of late. It's been that kind of month. Is there anything he said, any policy he's espoused, anything that you'd like to take issue with, or anything that you would be doing vastly differently if you had the job right now? Well, I mean, I think first things first is rebuilding the team. There's been an exodus of some of the state's finest Christian attorneys, many of whom worked with First Liberty. I used to clerk for a federal judge that also had clerks that defended religious liberty in the public square. Honestly, I think we could do a lot more on the border. I visited with you, Mark, about my lawsuit against the Biden administration to compel them to do their job and to spend the federal monies that were appropriated. A lot more we can do on law enforcement. I've visited now with about a majority of county sheriffs. There's about 111 county sheriffs in Texas that make less than $55,000. And considering that teachers and judges in Texas have gotten pay raises in the last 5 years, 2 legislative sessions, I think we can all agree that law enforcement need to be reexamined in terms of their pay, their benefits, and the resources that they need to do their job.
George P. Bush on Twitter and georgepbush.com, the campaign website. Always a pleasure to have you on, sir. Look forward to the next time. Thank you, and safety and good wishes on the campaign trail.